Have more people in the waiting room.
Now she needs to give you access, and then you can go inside. She
Admit.
yeah, admit. Okay, done.
What a wonderful crowd we have. Thank you for coming today. I'm Liz England. I'm the founder of the Career Path Development Professional Learning Network in TESOL International Association. And we are here with you today in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, where I'm working with a group of about 40 teachers on the TESOL International Association's I'm hearing my voice, it's confusing, core certificate program. And we're almost finished with the adolescent learners one. And we're very excited to be here in Tashkent. I'll be going soon to Nukus in the western part of the country. Welcome, everyone. Linda Chu is our very, very wonderful moderator and program organizer of these webinars. And I welcome Linda and turn it over to her, and she'll make an introduction to our fabulous speaker, Nikki Ashcraft. Linda, welcome.
Lovely group, and I would like to thank also Lynn, our tech manager of our TESOL CPD leadership team, for being here. And we have a wonderful speaker today. We are all very excited to hear Dr. Nikki Ashcraft. And thank you, Nikki, for agreeing to do this webinar for us, for our group. Nikki is an associate teaching professor at the University of Missouri, and she's a TESOL leader, and she is going to be talking to us about writing your philosophy of teaching statement. And so we're very happy to introduce Nikki. And at the end, I will have a few more announcements for you, so please stay tuned for that. But for now, I would love to turn it over to Nikki.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers of the Career Path Development Professional Learning Network, Liz, Lynn, and Linda. And thank you to the TESOL International Association for giving us opportunities to form communities like this. And I'm just going to put a link here in the chat to the TESOL International Association, so that if any of you are not members, you can check out our association and join many other communities like this. So yes, our presentation today is on writing your philosophy of teaching statement. I'm just going to start my slideshow here. So first, I'd like to ask, have any of you already written a philosophy of teaching statement? Can you put in the chat yes or no? Have you already written one? I'm checking through the chat. Yes, yes. I see no, yes, not yet. Kind of a mix. Some people, yeah.
Yep.
In the middle of it. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully you'll get some ideas of ways to develop it. All right. Thank you. So I put this image here. Can you recognize this image of this sculpture? Yes. Can anybody identify it? Can anybody identify what this picture is? The thinker, yes. Yeah. So why do you think I put this image for this webinar? Yes, Rodin's The Thinker. I chose this image because when we write our philosophy of teaching statement, it involves a lot of reflection on our own teaching practice. Why do we do the things that we do in the classroom? What are the principles? What are the beliefs and values that support our classroom practice. So that's why I chose this image for this webinar. So in the next hour, we are going to talk about what is a philosophy of teaching statement. And I have abbreviated it on the rest of these slides as PTS. When might you need to write a philosophy of teaching statement? How does that philosophy of teaching statement differ from other kinds of documents that you have to write in your career? What should you write about in your philosophy of teaching statement? And we will spend the bulk of the time on that. And how can you get started writing your philosophy of teaching statement? And we will have a chance to spend probably between 8 and 12 minutes in some breakout rooms discussing some questions so that you can get started thinking about your philosophy of teaching statement. And then we'll conclude with how often should you revise this philosophy of teaching statement. And then we'll open it up for some Q&A and sharing of some of your philosophies of teaching. So first, what is a philosophy of teaching statement? One of the authors who has written a lot on this topic is Graham Crooks, and he has said that a philosophy of teaching can refer to a teacher's short statement of views about preferred teaching practices or teachers' perspectives concerning the ethically, morally, and philosophically important aspects of their work. Another definition from Bone is that it is a narrative essay which reflects on individuals' beliefs and values about teaching and learning, often including concrete examples of the ways in which that individual enacts those beliefs. So I think that part is important about the concrete examples, and we will see how that can play out in your philosophy of teaching statement. So we can get from those two definitions that a philosophy of teaching statement is a narrative. So it is not a list of bullet points. It is a narrative that is written in sentences and paragraphs and may look like an essay. It is short, 1 to 2 pages. And if you are writing your statement for a job application, it's important to see what the employers are asking for in terms of length for your philosophy of teaching statement. So it's short, 1 to 2 pages. It is written in first person, and many times other forms of academic writing kind of say, don't write in first person. You should, be objective and write in third person. But with the philosophy of teaching statement, it is a personal statement. So it's totally acceptable and expected that you should write it saying, I believe this, I do this in my classroom. So it is written in first person. It discusses your beliefs and values about teaching, your beliefs and values about learning. So what happens on the other side with students, and beliefs and values about English language teaching specifically, because we know that teaching other subjects are different. There are different issues that arise, different contexts. So you want to focus on your beliefs and values about English language teaching and learning. A philosophy of teaching statement, unlike other kinds of academic writing, does not include citations. So you would not have those in-text citations. You would not have the reference list. It is acceptable if there are some theorists, some scholars who have informed your work. It is acceptable to mention those theorists or scholars by name. So for example, if the idea of the zone of proximal development is something that influences your teaching, and it influences how you structure your lessons or how you sequence activities, it is perfectly acceptable to say, I'm influenced by Vygotsky's concept of zone of proximal development, or to refer to people who have written on philosophy of education like John Dewey, it's perfectly acceptable to mention the names of scholars and theorists who have influenced you, but you would not have a list of citations at the end of your statement. And as Bowen had pointed out for us, it gives examples of how these beliefs and values that you have said, I believe this, I value this, how those beliefs and values are realized in your teaching practice. So it's not enough just to say, I believe in communicative language teaching. You need to explain, how do you implement communicative language teaching? What does that look like in your classroom? If I came to observe your classroom, what would I see? What are some of the activities or interactions that I would notice that reflect this aspect of your philosophy of teaching? So it's very important to give those concrete examples to make that statement come to life. And another point that Crooks mentions later in his article is that the different statements within that statement of teaching philosophy, the different things that you say, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this, those different statements should be congruent. That is, they should not contradict each other. So for example, if I say in one part of my teaching statement that I want to make students feel comfortable, I want them to not be afraid of making mistakes, I want them to be confident speakers, I want them to speak fluently. If I put that in one part of my teaching statement, and then in another part of the teaching philosophy statement, I say, accuracy is very important. I'm going to correct every error that my learners make. Those are contradictions with each other. So you want to make sure that your philosophy of teaching is congruent and that it is comprehensive, that it does, it creates a whole picture of your approach to teaching, but that it doesn't have these kinds of contradictions in it. Okay, so when might you write a philosophy of teaching statement? So some of you have said that you already have written one. So can you share in the chat, when did you write it? Why did you have to write one? For a TESOL course, graduate courses? Anyone else who's written one? Why did you write it? Several people have said for a course. Job applications, definitely. So several people have said that they wrote one for an assignment in a TESOL course, and that is actually a very common assignment in a TESOL methods course, to have the students write their philosophy of teaching statement. And I actually think that it's harder to write it when you are a student, because you are reading so many ideas and they all sound really good, right? You want to do all of those things. So it can be hard to select what are the principles that are going to most inform your teaching, to write about those in that teaching philosophy statement. Once you've started teaching, it becomes a little bit easier, I think, to identify really what are those influences on your teaching practice, because you're in the classroom and those decisions you make on a day-to-day basis kind of push certain principles to the forefront of your mind. They kind of bubble up as you are teaching. And so I think it is actually easier to write it once you've had some teaching experience, and it's a more, you can see more how the different ideas have impacted your decisions on a day-to-day basis. So definitely an assignment in a TESOL methods course is one time people have to write. For a job application, so people have mentioned that. And I'm going to stop sharing here for a second so I can show you some job advertisements here, because it is very see. All right. It is very common in job advertisements that they ask you to submit a number of different documents, including a teaching philosophy statement. So I'm just going to show you one job advertisement here.
You got 5 more minutes and then you're gonna have to brush your teeth.
Okay. All right, here is one job advertisement that I just recently located on the Careers Center for the TESOL International Association. And so this is a position for a lecturer for English for academic purposes at NYU in Shanghai. And just as an example, this job, you can see it is an active job that it has the description of the university, what kind of qualifications that they are looking for. And you notice here under application instructions, they want a lot of things. They want the cover letter, they want your CV, letters of recommendation, and a 1-page teaching philosophy statement. So it is very common to have this as part of a job application package. But as I mentioned before, when we talked about length, it's important to pay attention to what length that they are asking for, because you don't want to write too short or too long. I actually recommend that when people start developing their philosophy of teaching statement, that they might write a much longer statement for themselves. And then later they can, as they are applying for different jobs, kind of tailor that statement more for the different jobs. Let me get back to where I was here. For the different jobs, and then they can extract parts of that longer statement that are more relevant for that particular job. All right. Sometimes as a teacher, we are evaluated by our supervisors on an annual basis. They might come in and observe our classes and ask us to submit our portfolio of materials to show what we've accomplished during the year, what our students have accomplished during the year. And sometimes a philosophy of teaching statement is part of that annual performance review. If you go up for a promotion in your job, if you're going up for a supervisor position or coordinator position, they might ask to see that philosophy of teaching statement. To apply for a teaching award, I know we have a lot of great teachers here with us today. So if you ever apply for a teaching award, that could be part of that application process to submit your philosophy of teaching statement. For your own reflection, and this is actually really important because sometimes we're so busy all the time that we don't always have a lot of time to really reflect on our teaching. And so just having that opportunity to sit down and reflect on your teaching, why are you doing the things that you do? That can be really powerful in your own professional development. I also want to say that even if you think you might not ever write a philosophy of teaching statement, it is still important to be thinking about your philosophy of teaching statement. You might go for a job interview and they didn't ask you to submit a written philosophy of teaching statement, but when you go for the interview, they pop out that question, tell us, what is your philosophy of teaching statement? So it's good to be ready to be thinking about that when you go for your job interview, even if you haven't written it out for them. Okay, and another reason you might write a philosophy of teaching statement is to share with students or with their parents. So you might not write, you might not put a complete like 1 or 2 page philosophy of teaching on your syllabus, but you can summarize that and include it on your syllabus. Or when you meet with parents, you know, they might question some of the things that you do in the classroom. So you can be ready to explain, why are you doing this? What is your philosophy of teaching and learning? And how are the things that you are doing in the class contributing to their child's learning? So it can be something that we write for ourselves, and it can be something that we write for others. So how does the philosophy of teaching statement differ from other kinds of career documents? So I'm just going to talk about these different kinds of documents. So a cover letter, how does it differ from a cover letter? So the cover letter, when you apply for the job, is a letter. It has a letter format. So it's addressed like Dear Selection Committee. And in that letter, you're going to explain that you are applying for a specific job. You express your intention to apply for the job, and you summarize how your qualifications meet the requirements of that job. So you will talk somewhat about your teaching in a cover letter, but you're not going to really go into a lot of detail at that point about what you do in the classroom. Your CV is also usually required when you apply for a job, and a CV is more of an outline of all of your professional experiences. And it's usually divided into the sections like education, your teaching experience, whether you have done any conference presentations, whether you have publications, do you belong to any professional associations, other kinds of professional activities that you might engage in, like volunteer work or committee work. And it's all outlined there with details about what did you do, where did you do it, when did you do it, all of that information, so that they can you can document the experience that you've had. I have seen some CVs, especially in academic contexts, that are 50 pages long. So, you know, when you're starting out, it might only be like 2 pages. But again, you're not going to go into a lot of details about your teaching practice in that CV, but you would outline what are the experiences that you've had. If you're applying for a job that requires you to conduct research, you might also be asked to submit a research statement. And so the research statement is going to talk about what are your research interests? What are the kinds of questions that you are interested in researching? If you've already been conducting research, how do you see your research trajectory? How do you see one research study building on another, and where do you want to go in the future? And you might also talk about your preferred research paradigm, like, are you more of a qualitative researcher or a quantitative researcher? Again, that research statement is probably only 1 or 2 pages, but you're not really talking about teaching. In this case, but you might mention how your teaching has led to you having research questions, or has informed your research, or how your research has informed your teaching. But really the focus is on the research for that statement. I live in the United States, and in the United States, in higher education, it is also becoming more common to ask applicants to submit a diversity statement. So the diversity statement is asking about your experiences working or interacting with people from different backgrounds than you might have. So diversity here means all forms of diversity. It could be gender diversity, sexual orientation, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, age, religious diversity, cultural diversity. It could be any kind of diversity. So in the diversity statement, then you're talking about what has your experience been interacting with people from different cultures and different backgrounds, and then how you support inclusion and equity in your work. So there could be some element of teaching discussed in the diversity statement, but it's also broader than teaching, because it's not only interactions with students, but interactions with colleagues, interactions with staff, interaction with community members. So it's it does touch on teaching, but it is a broader category than that. And then of course, the reference letters are written by other people that talk about your characteristics, your experience, your disposition, and how it is, you know, to work with you. So they're giving you a recommendation for a particular job or program. So so there are lots of different documents that we might write when we are applying for a job. So let's talk now more specifically about that philosophy of teaching statement. So what would you write about in the philosophy of teaching statement? So these are some of the things that you might write about. Really, So many things that we can write about in that statement. So for example, the goals of education. What do you believe the purpose of education is? Do you think that education is meant to form citizens, to make loyal citizens in the society? Is the goal to create workers for a capitalist society? Is the goal to liberate people from oppression? What is the goal of education in your mind? And we could also say for us, what is the goal of language teaching? Like, why are we language teachers? How does language teaching either lift people up or push them down? What has been your motivation for teaching? Why did you become a teacher? That is also something common for people to write about, particularly in the introductory section of their philosophy of teaching statement. Why did they want to become a teacher? If you've had experience as a language learner, you might talk about that. What languages have you learned? And so what have you learned about language teaching and language learning from being on that learner side of the equation? You might talk about roles of the teacher and roles of the learner. So thinking about what kinds of things do teachers do in the classroom and what kinds of things do learners do in the classroom? You might think about your learners and the kinds of needs that they have. And this addresses, like, how do you find out about your learners' needs? How do you address your learners' needs? Like, what kind of strategies do you use to collect information about your learners? And how do you adapt your instruction to meet those different needs? So if you're working with children, you might have a certain approach to teaching because of the nature of children, that they have shorter attention spans, that they have the less ability to do abstract thinking. They need to move around more. You're going to have a certain approach to teaching with children than you would with adults. Similarly, you might have a different approach to teaching if you're working with beginners than if you were working with beginning or intermediate students. So thinking about how you address the needs of your learners, that's also part of your philosophy of teaching statement. I'll give you an example with this. I have always taught adults as a language teacher, and now as a teacher educator, I also work with adults, and my doctorate is in adult education. So for me, the fact that my learners are adults is really important and influences my teaching philosophy, because I believe that it's really important to treat the students as adults, to bring in the experiences that they have as adults. They have a lot of life experience, they have a lot of work experience, professional experience, to be able to bring those experiences into the classroom, to make sure that everything I do is relevant for them as adults, and also that they have these experiences they can learn from each other, and to give them opportunities for that kind of interaction where they can share and learn from each other in the classroom. So the fact that my learners are adults is really important for my philosophy of teaching. Also, you might talk about your approach to planning classes. Are you really a detailed planner, or are you more spontaneous?
TV off.
What is your approach to teaching? Do you follow any particular language teaching methodology, like communicative language teaching or total physical response? Or is there some methodology that you have embraced and that you implement in your classes? What kinds of materials do you like to use? Do you like having a structured textbook, or do you like to make your own materials? Do you like to use student-generated materials? Do you like to bring in authentic materials? That also pertains to your philosophy about what kinds of materials to use. How do you approach assessment? Are you more on the formal assessment or the informal assessment? The formative or the summative assessment? What do you think about the relationship between the teacher and the learner? Or is it like mentor-mentee? Is it like parent and child? How do you view that relationship? And then finally, what is the role of language in the classroom, the learner's language and also the learner's culture and the target culture and also world cultures. How do those interplay in your classes? Some teachers are very strict and don't like their learners to speak their own language in the class. Other teachers feel like that's a resource. We need to use it. We need to draw on that to help with their language learning. There's a lot of discussion now and talk about translanguaging. So what is your view on that? And looking at culture, how much emphasis should be placed on the learner's culture? Maybe you and your students share the same culture, but maybe you're from different cultures. So how much emphasis should be placed on the learner's culture? How much emphasis should be placed on the target language culture? So in this case, it could be American culture, US culture, Canadian culture. And what about world cultures? We know that English is an international language and that the majority of people who speak English together are not native speakers of English, that it's much more common for two non-native speakers of English to interact with each other than it is for a person to interact with a native speaker. So what do our learners need to know about world culture in order to have communicative competence in English? So those are all kinds of questions that we need to be thinking about as we write a philosophy of teaching statement. Now, obviously, it's not possible to get all of that in one page or even 2 pages. So you're going to have to be selective then and choose the principles that are most influential on your teaching practice. What are the principles that you have in mind when you are designing your lessons? What are the principles that you have in mind in that moment when you are teaching your class and you make a decision? For example, you have called on a student to talk, to share an answer, and then other students keep talking. At that moment, you decide, I'm going to tell these other students, shh, please stop talking. This person has a turn. What influenced you to do that? You have some beliefs behind that, such a simple action. You have some belief behind that everyone has a voice, that we have to respect each other. Even the very simplest decisions that we make have a philosophy behind them. So you will need to think then about what are those principles that guide your day-to-day movements and that are most important for you as a teacher. And those are the things that you will write about in your philosophy of teaching statement. So we're going to see 2 examples here. And the examples, because this is a webinar and I just have a slide, I cannot show you an entire philosophy of teaching statement, but I'm going to show you a paragraph from 2 different philosophies of teaching statements. And then we will compare those 2 statements. Which one do you think is better and why is it better? So here is the first example. I follow the communicative language teaching approach. Fluency is more important than accuracy. Learners must interact with each other. I try to get all learners to participate in the activities. I foster their autonomy in the classroom and build their confidence. I consider myself a facilitator of learning. I view the learners as whole human beings. I am a bridge between the L1 language and culture and the L2 language and culture. I bring authentic materials into my lessons and use technology to motivate learners. Okay, that's example 1. Here is example 2. Learners are autonomous individuals. I foster learner independence by equipping learners with learning strategies that they can use both inside and outside the classroom. For instance, I teach my learners how to use tools such as online dictionaries to learn spelling, pronunciation, and word meaning for themselves. I give them choices and the kinds of assignments they complete. In a recent unit on simple present tense, learners could write about their own daily routine, about the daily routine of a pet, or the imagined daily routine of a celebrity. So I'm going to go back. Let me ask you, which of those two examples do you think is a better example for a philosophy teaching statement? Okay, I see two people saying 2. Everybody's saying 2. Okay, any thoughts? Why? Okay, so Myrna says because it's more specific. Okay, so let's look at 1 again. In example 1. This statement, it sounds good, right? I've heard all of these things when I've been reading, about language teaching. I hear all of these things. I think all of these practices are promoted in the field of TESOL. They all sound really good. The problem that I see, though, is that it's very superficial. There's so much in here, but none of it is explained in depth. There are so many ideas in here: communicative language teaching, fluency versus accuracy, interaction, participation, learner autonomy, confidence, being a facilitator, the learners as whole human beings, being a bridge between L1 language and culture and L2 language and culture, authentic materials, technology. It's like, it's all in there, right? But it doesn't really tell me, if I were to hire this person, like if I'm an employer, I want to hire this person, what would I actually see them doing in the classroom? How do they realize these beliefs? So the second example, I did construct it to be a better example because all of it is focused on one main idea. All of it is focused on the autonomy of the learner. And the person gives 2 examples of 2 subpoints related to learner autonomy, and then examples of those subpoints. So the person says learners are autonomous, and they talk about learning strategies and how they teach their learners to use learner strategies autonomously. And they talk about learner choice, and they give an example of how they give their learner a choice in the class. So this idea is like fully developed. So think about it then, when we go back to that list of all the things that you could potentially talk about. It's good when you have your introduction to your philosophy of teaching statement to point out, just like you would for any essay, you're going to have that thesis statement that says, my philosophy is guided by these beliefs, A, B, C, D, or however many you talk about, A, B, C, D. And then to talk about A in depth, to talk about B in depth, C in depth, and D in depth. So that's, in that sense then, in your 1 or 2 page statement of teaching philosophy, you might really only be able to talk about 4 or 5 principles that guide your practice in depth. So you don't want to do like the example 1 and trying to cover everything you can in 1 paragraph. You want to develop those ideas and explain how those principles are realized in your teaching practice. Okay, so how can you get started writing your philosophy of teaching statement? Crooks in 2003, he recommends a couple steps. First, he says to think about your own biography. And I added there, and your identity, because Crooks wrote that in 2003 and identity research wasn't as prevalent as it is now. But to think about your own biography, who are you as a teacher and who are you as a learner? And thinking about that, how you became a teacher, what was your experience as a learner? How have those experiences shaped what you do in the classroom? That is one way to get started thinking about your philosophy of teaching. Another way is to record yourself teaching and look at your video. I know that can be the scary thing, is to look at yourself teaching, but look at that video. And when we're at the moment when we're teaching, sometimes everything cannot be as conscious. Much of what we do sometimes is unconscious or automatic. And when you have that video, you can really analyze your behaviors in the classroom, say, why did I do that? And actually, there's a few of my students who are in my practicum course in the webinar today. And very often when I teach our practicum course, and my students in the practicum have to record themselves, and they also watch each other's videos. And most often at the end of the semester, the students say that was the most valuable part of the course, was that opportunity to record myself and to watch myself teaching. So record yourself, analyze your behaviors, and think about, why did you do those things that you did? Another step is to observe other teachers teach. So it could be that you observe a colleague at your school, but if you can't do that, there are so many videos online now on YouTube that you could observe, to think about, why did that person do that? You can't know for sure, but to just question, why do you think that they did that? That can also help you think about your own teaching philosophy. And then also to talk to other teachers about their teaching. And that is what we are going to do now. We have 46 people here today, and I have written a list of reflection questions. You can find it at this link in Google Drive. I've also put the QR code if that helps people. Let's see if it's in the chat. Yes, it is. Thank you. So it's in the chat. So please go to that list of questions. Select one question that you would like to discuss. As we have highlighted, it's not possible to write about everything in your philosophy of teaching statement. You want to choose the ones that are most important for you. So look at those questions, choose one that you think is important for you. We're going to go into breakout rooms. I think probably, let's say 9 minutes for the breakout rooms. We're going to have 4 or 5 people in the breakout rooms. And you'll have 9 minutes. Everyone can choose your own question. That is fine. You do not all have to discuss the same question. So each person choose your own question that you would like to share, talk about with other teachers. Why is this important to you? What is your belief around this? And how do you enact that in the classroom? So I will be popping in to just, chat with some of the groups, but we'll have 9 minutes, and then we come back, we'll have some conclusion, sharing, and answering questions.
19
So it looks like everyone is back. I hope you had a good discussion, at least about one or two of the questions. No, they are big topics, so you're going to have to think more about them in the future. And again, narrow it down to those principles that are most important for you to develop in your statement of teaching philosophy. So we looks like we have about 7 minutes left. And so I just want to conclude here by addressing this question: how often should you revise your philosophy of teaching statement? So you spent all this effort into writing this statement, and maybe you've used it for job applications or other things. So what do you do with it at that point? You know, do you just like toss it aside and like maybe 10 or 15 years later pick it up again and say, oh wait, was this my philosophy at that time? You know, we're always growing and changing as teachers. We're always developing. So that statement that you wrote when you were a student is not going to be applicable, you know, once you've been teaching for a couple of years. That statement that you used when you applied for your job is not going to be relevant in another 10 years. So how often should you revise it? Really, that's up to you. I think some obvious times are when you begin to look for a new job, you want to dust off that statement that you've written before and read it and think about it. Does it really reflect what I think now? Does it reflect my philosophy now? There might be some aspects of it that are the same, and there are other things that you're going to want to change. Whenever you've had changes to your current job, that's also a good time to revise your philosophy of teaching statement, to think back, you know, is this really relevant? I know that so many of us over the past 2 years have had to transition to teaching online, and that is very different. And some of the things that we believed about teaching and learning and things that we would do in our face-to-face classes, we can't do those things anymore. So let's say if I believe that interaction is important for language learning, I implemented that in a particular way when I had a face-to-face class. But when I go now to teaching online, it's going to look different. I still believe that. I still have that principle in my mind when I'm teaching, but that how do I implement that interaction? How do I create it and foster it? It's going to look different in the online setting. So I would need to revise my teaching philosophy statement then to show how am I doing that in the online setting. So you also may have taken on new responsibilities in your job. So maybe you started out just as a teacher, but then later you became in charge of selecting textbooks, and you became in charge of developing the curriculum or coordinating the curriculum. You became the coordinator of assessments. So taking on these different responsibilities is also going to impact what's most important to us at any point in time in our teaching practice. So if you've had some kind of major changes to your current job, you might want to revise your philosophy of teaching statement. And you can revise your teaching philosophy statement whenever you want to reflect on your teaching. And the at the last TESOL convention, Donovan and Nichols gave an interesting presentation about how to use your written philosophy statement as a way to evaluate your teaching, kind of turning the tables, taking that statement and using that statement to evaluate your teaching. So they recommend things like, you know, reviewing your statement and then looking at your lesson plan. Are the criteria that you outlined in your statement, are they evident in your lesson plan? Are you actually, you know, are you actually practicing what you preach in your philosophy of teaching statement? Are you really doing that in your lesson plan? And similarly, they also recommend looking at your teaching video. When you look at yourself teaching, are you living that philosophy that you wrote about in your philosophy of teaching statement? So they suggest using that as a document to help kind of keep us on track. When we say that we believe something, are we really doing that in our teaching? So I would like to open it up for any questions or comments now. It looks like we only have about 3 or 4 minutes, but I would love to hear what anybody wants to ask or wants to share about their own experience writing philosophy of teaching statement.
Nikki, somebody asked about the philosophy of teaching statement continuously updated and revised over time, or is there any predestined path as a vision that you're going to stick to? That's a really good question.
So, well, when you say continuously, it's not like, every month, but probably, it's good every year, 2 years to look at it. And is there a predestined path? I would say no. I mean, we have things that we know to be best practices in our field, but it really depends on your context. Who are your learners? What are you teaching? So there's not, just like there's not one best way to teach, there's not one best teaching philosophy. So yes, it's good to continuously have your philosophy in mind. I will say, have it in mind, but to actually revise the statement, I think if you revise it once every 1 or 2 years, whip it out, look at it. But then is there a predetermined end that you should get to? No.
There's a really good question in the chat right now.
Mhm.
Ruslan has asked, in Uzbekistan, we coincide teaching and upbringing because they are closely connected and inseparable. Do you take into consideration when I write teaching philosophy referring to my culture? So does culture come into it?
I would think so, because your part of that is reflecting on your identity of who you are as a teacher and who you are as a learner. And so that culture is part of your identity. So yeah, I think you could definitely talk about how your culture has influenced how you think about teaching and think about learning.
And Damon, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. First, what a substantive, comprehensive, well-organized presentation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
My question is one on looking at your 2 examples that you gave earlier and thinking about how people write and talk about things. Could you comment something on style? I know like the first one sounded very, like I da da da, I da da da, I da da da. I mean, there should be some sort of a kind of a style where you focus more on what you're saying rather than on I.
Mm-hmm. I think it's good to use your own voice and your own style of writing. It is normally written in first person, but of course that person might have, in terms of just the way they constructed their sentences, they may have used more complex sentences or compound sentences. But I think you want your voice to shine through in your philosophy of teaching statement. Many times when you think, why do employers ask for these, statements? They're trying to imagine what you are like as a teacher and what you are like as a colleague, and what's it going to be like to work with you on a daily basis. So I think it's really good to let your own style of writing, your own voice shine through. If you're kind of more informal, like to make jokes or, be sarcastic, or, that can come out in your philosophy of teaching statement. Or if you're a more, structured, serious, formal person, that can come out as well. So you want it to be in your own voice.
Thank you.
Yes.
Fatma had a question as well, Fatma Fatoumi. She asked, do you think technological progress is affecting our teaching philosophy?
So I can kind of interpret this in 2 ways. So one way that, yes, we do have to, if we are using technology in our classes, if we're teaching online, we probably would want to address that in our philosophy of teaching statement. But also, another way that I might interpret this is sometimes our philosophy of teaching statement can take different forms. It might not always be a written 2-page document. people can be more creative now with how they present that philosophy of teaching. So maybe they make a video, maybe they use like Adobe Spark and have this presentation with like pictures and music and, you know, their voice talking over it. So there are different ways we might present that philosophy of teaching statement. I would be careful though, if you're using it for a job application, to make sure you're meeting the requirements that what are they asking you to submit for the job application. So do we
Are
have
there-
any other questions? I did put if you do have access then to that list of questions. And here are a few, these are the references that I mentioned just in the presentation, but on the document that you could access in Google Drive, there's the list of questions. And then at the end of that is a more extensive bibliography on writing your philosophy of teaching statement. So Brown, Crooks has written a lot about how a teaching philosophy statement is actually reflective of philosophy versus just a description of teaching practices. And then also the Payant and Hirano that's listed there, they've done some research on what do people normally write about in their philosophy of teaching statement. So you might want to look at some of those other references that are on the bibliography. And my email is on that handout as well. And my email is also here on this slide. So I would be happy to hear from any of you with questions or comments or just to get in touch.
How wonderful. Thank you so much, Nikki. We really appreciate your time and your efforts to inform us on this topic, and such an important topic for many of us. And I think you've given us a lot to think about, and maybe a lot of people are now getting in the thought of, oh, let me try to write my teaching philosophy statement. So
Good.
great. Thank you so much. I also, before everyone leaves, would like to let you know that we will have another webinar. Our next webinar is going to be Eastern time. It will be November 29th at 7 p.m. But this person who is going to give the webinar, Jesse Labriste Jr., is in the Philippines from Manila. So and the time there will be 8 a.m. November 30th in Manila. And I will post this information on our Facebook page and also on our TESOL site so that you can see it. But Jesse's going to be talking about contextualizing learning and instruction, consideration for a culturally responsive language education. So it sounds like an interesting topic, and I hope you'll be able to join us.
I think Linda got it frozen there.